I'd love to talk to you. You guys have to stop them from building. They're going to build a liquefied natural gas terminal in San Juan, a small one in San Juan, in the port, right there. It's very, very dangerous to have something like that right in your capital city. So I hope there'll be a movement in Puerto Rico to stop that.
Obviously,
Well,
obviously the colonial history of Puerto Rico implicates both U.S. political parties, and the system was built more to benefit the United States than Puerto Rico. So I think that is sort of the broader issue that we're seeing symptoms of, you know, this many decades later, that goes into why the energy infrastructure that was set up was ill-suited for Puerto Rico, and why they were so dependent on oil imports, and then why that system became so corrupt and mismanaged. It kind of all comes from this, you know, this tree of this colonial history.
I don't think everything owned by the government is the goal of most of the advocates I've met in Puerto Rico. Who do you work with again? Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, yes, please do. And if you'd like to, go ahead.
Sure. So just on this topic of privatizing, one of the things that is on the table is not really decentralizing or giving us any sort of accountability and transparency, because some of the bidders are the power players in the energy industry, Duke Energy, for example, among many others. And one of the issues is that once they own parts of the grid, it becomes very hard to solicit information because they own their own data, for example. As opposed to now, Puerto Rico, PREPA, by virtue of being a public corporation, I was able to conduct this research in part because we have constitutional rights to data on anything that is public. And I was able to use some leverage based on a previous court case whereby the Center for Investigative Journalism won a case in which all of the death certificates had to become public, and set a precedent for enforcing this constitutionally elevated mandate for public data. So that's one of the challenges that I encountered when I tried to replicate this study that I'll talk a little bit about very briefly in places like Texas and Florida, because they have also private-owned utilities. And yes, there are some cooperative organizations and firms that operate there, but by and large, power remains in very few hands in some of these states, like Florida Power and Light being one of them. But let me talk briefly about the project that I conducted. And I want to thank Marla and Cecilio and the filmmakers as well for being, of course, an inspiration for a lot of this work and this convening. And I think that the impetus for having this kind of convening has been this question of to what extent can folks in the academic circles and university institutions act as first responders. And that is exactly the kind of sentiment that I had on the night in which Hurricane Maria passed through what is my home, my birthplace, Puerto Rico. And I quickly realized after managing to get a hold of my family a few days after that I was not the traditional kind of first responder, even though that's what I had kind of wanted to do. But my family was like, don't come here, we don't have water or food for us, let alone for you, you're going to be a burden. So I had to ask myself, what skills do I have? And I realized, well, I'm a social scientist. And when I managed to get down to Puerto Rico that winter break, I had a few conversations on the ground, and there was a widespread sentiment that folks in certain neighborhoods were not going to get power back quickly because they weren't in the right neighborhood. They weren't necessarily politically connected, they weren't in an affluent neighborhood, they weren't in a predominantly touristy neighborhood. So I set out to investigate that, which is of course something that, again, I was able to do after, it took me about 100 days of calling Prepa every day. It was the first thing I would do in the morning after making myself a little bit of coffee. And eventually, one day, they sent me the files as JPEG. And I told them I can't do anything with that, so I need them in an Excel format. And eventually, they dug through, I don't know what, files and their emails, and they sent me all these files. In these files, it contained the 18,000, what they call missions. Every brigade, every crew, every lineman crew that they sent in the aftermath of Maria to restore power. This is a very powerful source of information, of course. And our research question was, in the wake of this kind of disaster, who gets power back first and by which logics? We hypothesized that ruling party supportive neighborhoods and municipalities were going to have to wait less for getting power back, and that other elements of privilege would play in, like more affluent neighborhoods would wait less, and neighborhoods with higher indices of poverty, female poverty, for example, would also have to wait more. As I did this project, I remember speaking with an emergency operator in Florida who told me that there's this saying in emergency operations that goes something like, when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So we noticed that there are, in fact, priorities throughout the course of this research project. I can talk more about the specifics of how we ran this statistical analysis, but basically what we find in our project is that we confirm our hunch, and not only our hunch, this really came from people, really. So as I spoke with folks, a lot of people said, I feel anecdotally that you're going to confirm your hypothesis, and people knew, and now we have the numbers to prove it, right? That ruling party supportive neighborhoods weighted less, specifically municipalities weighted less, and again, no surprise. There was public outcry around this question throughout the restoration. More affluent neighborhoods weighted less, among other kinds of inequality in the process. But another thing that I learned throughout the process, and it's something that I think is emphasize in the film, and this is why I think the film is an important teaching tool, is that inequality in relation to environmental disasters, climate disasters, in relation to the environment more generally, begins well before an event like Hurricane Maria. Inequality also begins in the process of deciding where will these corporations, public or private, are going to invest in what they call hardening the grid, which includes investing in flood prevention, investing in more resilient infrastructure, like instead of having wooden poles, having poles made out of other harder materials, among other kinds of things that they call hardening, putting underground transmission lines, among other kinds of ways in which they can harden the grid. So basically, it's important to think of the inequality that occurred after Maria in a broader context that I think the film does a great job of providing a context whereby there was investment in industry, empowering industry, as opposed to empowering households that were consuming this energy and whose lives depended on their ability to consume this energy. So as we were doing this project, and I'll end with this, we began to do some analysis, and here are a few main points of our analysis. This project is not about saying, you know, we got you, you did it wrong. It was thinking through how do we prevent loss of life moving forward, specifically as it relates to having access to energy. As we were interviewing emergency operators and folks who were working in both public and private energy utility companies, we realized that they always said that race was never a factor, that what we call the colorblind restoration process. And what I argue here is that if it is precisely because they don't take into account the ways in which their logics for restoration are already privileging certain communities, that we produce these kinds of inequalities. So we see these inequalities almost as a result of the same design that goes into these logics of restoring power. And in order to prevent that, what we're proposing is that we adopt a more affirmative restoration approach in order to ease the burden of marginalized communities, communities of color, impoverished communities in these processes, which of course exacerbate pre-existing inequalities in these communities. We also want to raise awareness about what we're calling energy or climate clientelism, what may be this phenomenon of providing services in the wake of disasters to communities that hold a more favorable opinion of your administration. So I will end that there, and we'll continue the discussion. Oh, no. That's okay. Yeah.
I think we have issues of travel and return to the hotels, and we want to take again our panel with this excellent opportunity. And see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Oh my God.
Brilliant. Really.
I think the topic
Pensaba que no era pregunta en serio. Mucho gusto, un placer. Todo bien aquí, Saludos, Carlos.
Thank you for standing.
Where are you staying?